Welcome to the Raymarine course overview for the JP Morgan Asset Management Round the Island race. We're here from a fairly blustery Yarmouth, and I am expecting the wind to be from a similar direction on Saturday, but not quite as strong. Now, being a northerly wind, it is going to change the tactics slightly from what we would call a normal round the island race. Initially, the start is going to be a little bit easier because there won't be that awful dilemma of do we tack into Cowes Green and risk the other boats as we tack out again, or do we stay out and miss out on the tide. So the choices at the start will be a little bit more, do we stay the island side for the strongest tide, going close by the buoys at Gurnard, or do we head more for the north shore? There's an old saying in the Solent that if the wind's in the north, you should go north. Now this is to take advantage of any little bullets of wind that are coming out of Bewley and off the New Forest. Now, as you work your way down the Solent, it is going to make a difference between the type of boat, what spinnakers you're flying, if you're flying spinnakers at all. So that'll dictate the tactics a little bit, whether you're going for wind angle or for maximum tide. Now, as we get down towards Yarmouth here, the tide will be running strongly. It's one of the strongest places in the whole of the Solent for the tide. Now, do read your sailing instructions, because there is an exclusion zone around the moorings at Yarmouth here. Also, watch out for black rock, because it would be an awful way to end your race sat on a rock before you're even out of the Solent. Now, approaching Hurst Castle and Hurst Narrows, there's going to be a compression of boats. There'll be a lot of boats around, and we'll probably have a little bit of a jibing duel going down towards the Needles. Tide's still going to be pushing the boats down to the south, so you do need to be a little bit careful. You'll be covering the ground rather faster than you think you might be. And that does come to the dilemma, do we go inside the wreck and between the wreck and Goose Rock, or round the outside? Now, being downwind with spinnakers, it's a very narrow gap to go through. The tide's going to be falling, so if you do hit, you'll stick. And the tidal range over Goose Rock is less than the tidal range at Portsmouth. So at Portsmouth, I think we're looking at about 3 metres of a tidal range. It will be quite a bit less down by the Needles. So my suggestion would be take the slightly safer route and go outside of the wreck. It's also very difficult if there's a number of boats all coming in towards the wreck. If the first boat changes their mind or hits the bottom, all the other boats are going to be piling in with nowhere to go with spinnakers up. So my tip would be go round the outside. The other reason for going round the outside is that once you go between the wreck and the rock, you're really then committed to doing an early jibe and going very close into the cliffs there. But the cliffs are going to give a big wind shadow with a northerly wind. So you'll probably find it better for the wind to be a little bit offshore and then head off towards St. Catherine's. Now, you have some choices here. Straight line, get the lunch out and sit back and enjoy it. Or work a little bit harder, work out your angles. Do you come into the island to avoid the tide a little bit, or a bit further offshore for a bit more wind? There'll probably be some peeling of spinnakers at this stage, and the wind is likely to go a little bit more to the west. So I think here is a place where boats can make up a lot of ground by just working hard. As we approach St. Catherine's, I think the wind will have gone round more to the west, particularly for the smaller boats and a little bit later. The tide turns there at about 11:30, so the big boats that are there first will be against the tide. They're the boats that are going to have to choose, shall we go inside of the tidal rip and go out of the tide, but then we do risk being less wind there, or do we go offshore, bit more wind, but pushing into the tide? Could be quite a critical place in the race. For the boats that are after the tide's turned, well, it makes it a little bit easier. You'll go with the tide, with the flooding tide, and then it'll be a fairly straightforward leg until Bembridge Ledge. Now, approaching Bembridge Ledge, spinnakers up, will be a little bit hectic. Need to, with the tide underneath you, need to perhaps drop a little bit early so that you're not heading off towards Chichester rather than coming back up the Solent. You'll be turning to port, and you'll be then also expecting the wind to go much more northerly. So I think it will be a beat from all the way from Bembridge Ledge right the way to the finish. Tacking in towards Sea View, again there's an exclusion zone, so you don't want to get too close in there. We have got the option of inside or outside of the forts, because I was reading the sailing instructions earlier, there's no mention of the fort, so we can come inside it, but do watch out for the shallow water. Again, as we're approaching Ryde Sands, it's very shallow and a lot of boats get caught out. Every year when I've done the Round the Island race, I've seen boats run aground there. There's also the added difficulty. If you tack in a little bit early, you come inside of the sands, you're watching the depth sounder, oh, it's getting a little bit shallow, so you then decide to tack. But because you've come inside of the sandbar, you tack and immediately run aground. So stay well off Ryde Sands. We will find that the wind is quite banded coming up the eastern Solent, because you'll get bands of wind coming down Southampton water, so probably going to be more wind towards Portsmouth and less on the island side. Could be quite a split there between the fleet wanting to stay island side to stay out of the tide, or going right across to over towards Hill Head. Once we're coming into the finish, well, we say it every year, and every year there's going to be a few boats. Do know which is your finishing line. It's so important and so disappointing. Go 50 odd miles around the island and you don't get a finish because you've crossed the wrong finishing line. So just to recap, my top tips for going around the island race would be, firstly, read your sailing instructions and get somebody else on board to read them as well, because you want to know, in the heat of the moment when everything's happening and there's lots of boats around, you do want to know what the rules are. Do your homework. Look at the tides. They're very important for the Round the Island race, and it's critical you know where the tidal gates are and what the time of the changing of the tides there is. You need to be sure that when you go round a mark, you're going to be going into the tide, or the tide's going to be with you. Also, the weather. Now, I would love to see you all at the Raymarine weather briefing at the Island Sailing Club at 6 o'clock on Friday evening. If you can't be there, log on to raymarine.co.uk, sign up for email updates, Twitter or Facebook, or alternatively, the briefing will be shown on Events TV around the island. And most importantly of all, have a great day out and stay safe.